The parking lot behind Dusty Mile Diner smelled like wet asphalt and engine grease when Sarah Voss heard the first crack of knuckles meeting bone. She had been carrying a bus tray stacked with coffee mugs and half-eaten plates of pie when the sound cut through the rain. Sharp, unmistakable, the kind of sound that doesn't belong to an accident. She set the tray down on the nearest table without thinking. Her body was already moving before her brain caught up, feet pulling her toward the side exit, hands pushing through the door into the cold Colorado night, and what she saw in that parking lot stopped her breath completely. An old man was on the ground. 3 younger men stood over him, and one of them was raising his boot. Sarah ran. She didn't weigh the odds, didn't count the men or calculate the risk, or do any of the reasonable things a person was supposed to do before throwing themselves into a situation like that. She crossed 15 feet of rain-slicked pavement in seconds and put herself between the boot and the man on the ground, and the boot connected with her shoulder instead, and pain lit up her arm like a downed power line, and she did not move. "Back up," she said. Her voice was steady. She had no idea how. "Back up right now." The man who had kicked her blinked. He was young, mid-20s, wearing a jacket that cost more than Sarah made in 2 weeks. He had the kind of face that had never heard the word no and processed it correctly. "Who the hell are you?" he said. "Someone who's not walking away," Sarah answered. "So you're going to have to go through me first." She had no weapon, no backup, no plan beyond the next 10 seconds. And the 3 men in front of her started to smile. Well, if you've been watching, stay until the very end, because this story is going to go places you don't expect. Hit subscribe, give this video a like, and drop a comment with the city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Sarah. Her name was Sarah Voss, and she was 27 years old, and she had been failing quietly for 8 months. The failure hadn't arrived all at once. It had come in stages, the way a crack moves through concrete, invisible for a long time, then suddenly structural. It started when Crestfield Regional Medical Center announced its first round of layoffs in 11 years, and Sarah's unit, a high-acuity trauma floor that had been hemorrhaging funding since the previous administrator resigned, was cut by 40%. She had been one of the last hired and among the first to go, and the fact that her performance reviews had consistently ranked her in the top tier of floor nurses didn't seem to factor into anyone's math. She had tried for 6 weeks to find another hospital position in Galton City, the mid-sized Colorado town where she'd built the closest thing she had to a life. She had 3 interviews. None of them called back. The 4th place she applied told her, politely, that her trauma background was strong, but they were looking for someone with more administrative experience, and she had sat in her car in their parking lot for 20 minutes after that, not crying, just staring at the dashboard, which was somehow worse. By month 3, she was behind on rent. By month 4, she had moved out of her apartment and into the 2nd bedroom of a house shared by 2 college students who were rarely home and didn't ask questions. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself this every morning while she drove to Dusty Mile Diner, where she picked up double shifts because the overnight differential added an extra $2.15 an hour and nobody else wanted to work 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. She wore her dark hair pulled back the same way she'd worn it in the hospital, out of habit more than necessity. She was quick and efficient and rarely got flustered when tables turned over fast or the kitchen got backed up. And Walt Okafor, the diner's night manager, said she was the best server he'd ever hired, which she appreciated even though it wasn't what she wanted to hear. She hadn't told anyone at the diner about her medical background. It didn't seem relevant, and she wasn't interested in the particular kind of sympathy that comment tended to generate. The slow head tilt, the "what a shame," the way people looked at you like you were already a cautionary tale. She was just the overnight waitress who refilled your coffee without being asked and never got your order wrong. That was enough. Most nights, Galton City was quiet enough that she could get through an entire shift without anything more complicated than a trucker who wanted extra gravy or a teenager who'd stayed out too late and needed to sober up over pancakes before driving home. The diner sat on the edge of Route 9, 2 miles from the nearest motel, surrounded by empty lots and a shuttered hardware store and a gas station that closed at 10. Not the kind of place where things happened. That was what she had believed until the night of the 17th of November, when the rain came down so hard it sounded like static, and the parking lot filled up with trouble she had not seen coming. The old man's name was Earl Maddox, and he had been coming to Dusty Mile every Thursday night for the better part of 2 years. Sarah knew his order by heart: black coffee, 2 sugars, the chicken fried steak with extra cream gravy, and a slice of peach pie if Walt had bothered to order it that week. He always sat at the end of the counter nearest the window, and he always arrived on a motorcycle that sounded like the engine had been rebuilt by hand because it had been, multiple times, by Earl himself. He was in his early 60s, lean and weathered in the particular way of men who had spent decades working outdoors with their hands and in the sun. He had a short gray beard and calm, dark eyes, and he moved deliberately, like someone who had learned a long time ago not to waste energy. He didn't say much, but when he did speak, it was worth listening to. Sarah had found him good company on slow nights, the kind of person who could sit in comfortable silence across a counter without making it feel awkward. She knew almost nothing about his past. He'd mentioned once that he'd served, in the vague way that some veterans did, like the information was available if you needed it, but not something that required elaboration. He worked at a machine shop 2 miles up Route 9 and seemed, to every outward appearance, like a quiet man living a quiet life in a small Colorado town. What she didn't know, what almost no one in Galton City knew, she would find out later. Much later. In the parking lot, in the rain, all she knew was that he was on the ground and someone was trying to hurt him, and that was enough. The 3 men had pulled in 20 minutes before close. Sarah had noticed them because she noticed everyone who came through the door, occupational habit, and because they had a particular energy about them that read wrong. Not dangerous exactly. Not yet. Just the kind of loud confidence that belonged to people who had never been held accountable for anything and knew it. The one in front was the tallest, blonde-haired, with the kind of jaw that photographers liked, and eyes that didn't quite match the smile beneath them. He wore his jacket open despite the cold, like the weather didn't apply to him. His 2 friends trailed behind him in the way that friends did when they weren't really friends but satellites, people who orbited the source of power and took their cues from it. They had ordered food, eaten it without complaint, and left a tip that was almost insulting without quite crossing the line into deliberate. Sarah had been clearing their table when she heard raised voices from outside and looked up to see Earl's motorcycle through the rain-streaked window and the 3 men standing around it. She got to the door in time to hear the tall one say, "Old piece of junk like that shouldn't even be on the road," and one of his friends laugh, and then the sound of something hitting metal. A kick or a fist, she couldn't tell. And Earl's voice, low and level, saying, "Don't." Just the one word. Don't. And then the tall one had shoved him, hard, and Earl had gone down on the wet asphalt and hit his shoulder against the parking block, and that was when Sarah came through the door. She had positioned herself between them before the calculation had fully completed in her head. She knew, on some level, that this was not the smart play. She was 5'5", 130 pounds, wearing a diner apron with a pen in the pocket, and there were 3 of them. These were not good odds. But Earl's hand was braced against the asphalt, and he was struggling to get up, and the tall man's boot had been coming down, and she had moved. "Last chance," the tall one said. He was close enough that she could see the rain on his eyelashes. "Walk back inside and pretend you didn't see anything." "I can't do that," Sarah said. "Why not?" She glanced down at Earl, who had gotten himself to one knee and was breathing hard, one hand pressed to his ribs. She could see the set of his jaw, the careful stillness of a man managing pain with long practice. "Because he's hurt," she said, "and you're not going to touch him again." The tall one, she would learn his name was Bryce Calloway, son of Gerald Calloway, one of the 3 largest commercial property developers in Galton City, seemed genuinely surprised by this. Not threatened, just surprised, the way a person was surprised when a vending machine gave them the wrong item. Minor inconvenience, easily corrected. "You're going to get hurt," he said. "I've been hurt before," Sarah said. She watched his face shift, the amusement curdling into something colder. He looked at her the way people looked at things that had stopped being interesting and started being in the way. "Hold her," he said. The 2 behind him moved faster than she expected. She got her elbow up in time to deflect the first grab, shifted her weight sideways, but the second one caught her by the arm and twisted, and the pain from where she'd already been kicked spiked hard, and she went down to one knee on the wet asphalt. From that position, she could see Earl clearly. He had made it to his feet. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't name. Not fear, not quite anger, something deeper and harder. Get up, he said quietly. Not to the men. To her. She pushed up from her knee. The man holding her arm yanked her back and she lost her footing completely and hit the ground on her side, and the impact knocked the breath out of her, and for a moment all she could do was lie there and try to remember how to pull air into her lungs. Bryce Calloway crouched down beside her. He smelled like expensive cologne and cigarettes, and he spoke very calmly. Nobody's coming for either of you, he said. Nobody's going to remember this tomorrow. You understand? Your little act of heroism is just going to end with you in the same ditch as this old man, and nobody, not the cops, not anybody, is going to lose a night of sleep over it. From somewhere above her, she heard Earl's voice. Step back. She looked up. Earl was standing, both hands at his sides. He was not in good shape. She could see the way he was holding his ribs, the tightness around his eyes. But he was on his feet, and his voice had shifted into something that cut through the rain like a frequency she hadn't heard before. Flat, precise, the kind of voice that was used to being obeyed. Bryce Calloway stood up and turned to look at him. Or what? He said. Earl didn't answer. He looked at Bryce the way you looked at a problem you'd already solved. Then Bryce's friend, the shorter one, the one who'd been hanging back, stepped forward and grabbed Earl by the jacket to pull him down again, and the collar tore, and in the gap of the torn fabric, caught for just a moment in the light from the diner's parking lamp, Sarah saw something on the inside of Earl's jacket lining. A patch. Military. She didn't recognize the specific insignia, but the design, the eagle, the specific arrangement of stars, the coloring, was not the kind of thing you put on a jacket as decoration. She filed it away. There wasn't time for anything else. Walt had called 911 from inside the diner. He would tell her this later, along with a detailed account of why he hadn't come out himself, which she listened to without comment because she needed the job. The police took 11 minutes to arrive, which felt much longer. By then, Bryce and his two friends had left, walked back to their car with the unhurried ease of people who didn't expect consequences, and Earl was sitting on the front bumper of a parked truck holding his ribs, and Sarah was sitting on the wet ground next to him because her knees had decided they were done for the evening. She had a cut on her cheekbone from the asphalt. Her left shoulder hurt badly enough that she suspected she'd torn something. She would find out later that two of her ribs were cracked. At the moment, she was focused on Earl, running through a quick clinical assessment the way she always did when her brain defaulted to training. Respiratory rate, color, responsiveness, the way he was guarding his left side. You need a hospital, she said. I've had worse, Earl said. That's not what I asked. He looked at her sideways. In the rain and the parking lot light, his face was hard to read. What did you do before the diner? He said. She blinked. Why? The way you moved back there. The way you're looking at me right now. He paused. That's not a waitress. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Trauma nurse, she said finally. Crestfield Regional, before the layoffs. Earl nodded slowly, like something had been confirmed rather than revealed. Combat medicine? I did a 2-year assignment with a field medical support unit. Liaison position. Why? Because, he said, the way you covered me when I went down. That's not hospital instinct. That's something else. She didn't answer that. The police cruiser was pulling into the lot, lights cutting through the rain. She was expecting nothing to come of it. That was the realistic assessment, and she had learned in the last 8 months to deal in realistic assessments. Bryce Calloway's father owned 3 commercial buildings in downtown Galton City and sat on the board of the City Planning Commission. The police report would be filed. The case would move slowly. Bryce would hire the kind of lawyer who made things move slowly on purpose. And in 6 months, maybe there would be some kind of plea arrangement that resulted in community service. And Earl's motorcycle would stay damaged. And Sarah would keep her cracked ribs and her $6 an hour tips, and that would be the end of it. She had given her statement, answered the officer's questions, and was sitting in the back of the ambulance with a cold pack on her shoulder when she heard Earl, 20 feet away, make a phone call. She couldn't hear most of it, just fragments. His voice, which had gone back to its usual quiet register. A single name. She thought she caught the word hail, but wasn't certain. And then, very clearly, the words, no, tonight. Then he hung up, and he walked over to the ambulance, and he looked at Sarah with those calm, dark eyes, and he said, I need you to let the paramedics check you out properly. Not argue with them, not minimize, okay? She frowned. I'm fine. You have a possible rib fracture and your shoulder is subluxed, he said. I watched your gait change in the last 15 minutes. She stared at him. How do you know that? I've seen it before, he said. A lot. He paused. I'm going to make some calls. Things are going to move quickly after that. I need you to be somewhere I can find you. Things are going to move quickly, she repeated. Earl. It's 2 a.m. Bryce Calloway's father is Gerald Calloway. Do you know who that is? Yes, Earl said. Then you know nothing is going to happen tonight. Earl looked at her for a moment. Something in his face was very still. Get your shoulder looked at, he said. Please. Well, she was admitted to Garrison Valley Hospital, the other hospital, the smaller one on the east side of Galton City that Crestfield staff had always referred to as the backup, with a specific kind of institutional condescension, at 3:40 in the morning, cracked second and third ribs on her left side, partially dislocated shoulder, which the attending reduced and which hurt considerably more in the reduction than the dislocation had, which she appreciated for its honesty, if nothing else. The cut on her cheekbone didn't need stitches. She was given a bed in a 6-bay observation unit while they monitored her for internal bleeding, which she was reasonably certain she didn't have but couldn't argue against, and she lay in the narrow hospital bed in the blue-gray dark of the overnight ward and listened to the sounds of the place, the monitors, the footsteps, the soft clatter of equipment, and felt the specific kind of ache that came from being in a hospital as a patient when you had spent years being one of the people who worked in them. She kept thinking about Earl's voice on the phone. No. Tonight. The word tonight at 3 a.m. meant something specific. It meant whatever Earl had called about was already in motion before the sun came up, and she didn't know what that looked like or what it meant, only that something in the weight of those 2 words made the hair on the back of her neck stand up in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. At some point she slept. She wasn't sure when. What woke her at 5:47 in the morning was not an alarm. It was sound. A sound she felt in her sternum before she fully processed it through her ears, deep, rhythmic, mechanical. The kind of sound that vibrated through walls and floors and made the water in her bedside cup shiver in concentric rings. Engines. A lot of them. She sat up too fast and her ribs objected, and she pressed her hand to her side and breathed through it and looked toward the window. The observation bay was on the ground floor, facing the hospital's east parking lot, and through the blind she could see the blue-gray pre-dawn light beginning at the edges of the sky. She got up carefully, padded to the window in her hospital socks, and angled the blinds with 2 fingers. The east parking lot of Garrison Valley Hospital, which held maybe 80 cars at capacity, was filling with vehicles. Military vehicles. Trucks mostly, and a specific kind of SUV she recognized from photographs and briefings she hadn't thought about in years, the kind with the blacked-out plates and the specific antenna configuration. They were arriving in groups, moving with the particular efficiency of units that had rehearsed deployment, and in the growing light she could see figures moving between them, men and a few women, many of them in civilian clothes, but moving in the synchronized, ground-eating way of people whose bodies had been trained to a specific standard. She counted 12 vehicles, then 16. Then she lost count. Her mouth was dry. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and stared at the parking lot and tried to make the image resolve into something that made sense. Her phone was on the bedside table. She picked it up and found a text message from an unknown number sent at 5:31 a.m. Ms. Voss, this is Captain Arden Hale. I'm a colleague of Earl Maddox. We spoke this morning. I'd like to come speak with you when you're ready. We're in the east lot. Take your time. She read the message twice. She read the name again. Earl Maddox. She had never known his last name. She crossed to the door of the observation bay and opened it, and the night nurse at the station looked up from her charts, and Sarah said, "Is there something happening in the east parking lot?" The nurse looked at her for a moment. Then she turned and looked through the glass doors of the unit toward the lobby, where another nurse was standing with both hands pressed to the window like she was watching a parade. "I honestly don't know," the night nurse said. "But someone from the front desk just called to say there are people out there asking for the patient from the parking lot incident. They said," she paused, looking at her note, "they said to tell her that Earl sends his regards and that she should eat something first if she can." Sarah stood in the doorway of the observation bay in her hospital gown and her socks, her ribs taped, her shoulder in a partial sling, looking at the growing cluster of headlights in the parking lot. She thought about Bryce Calloway crouching down next to her in the rain, his certain, comfortable voice. "Nobody's coming for either of you." She went back to her bed. She found the call button and pressed it, because her shoulder hurt and she needed something for the pain before she was going to be any use to anyone. The nurse came quickly. "Can I get something for the ribs?" Sarah said. "And do you have any crackers? Something small. I need to eat." The nurse nodded, already moving, and glanced toward the window again. "Do you know what's going on out there?" she asked. Sarah pulled the thin blanket back over her lap and leaned against the raised back of the bed and looked toward the window where the first gray light of morning was starting to define the edges of things. "I think," she said slowly, "someone is about to find out they made a very large mistake." She took a breath, and her ribs reminded her what she'd paid for last night, and she didn't look away from the window. Outside, more headlights turned into the lot. The crackers were stale, and the pain medication made her feel slightly underwater, which was not ideal for whatever was about to happen. But Sarah ate the crackers anyway, and drank half the cup of lukewarm water the nurse had left and spent the next 10 minutes doing the kind of slow, deliberate breathing she'd learned in a field medicine course 4 years ago. Not for calm, exactly, but for clarity. Getting the mind sorted before the body had to perform. She had asked the nurse to bring her clothes from the locker where they'd stored them during admission, and she changed carefully in the observation bay, favoring the shoulder, wincing when the tape on her ribs pulled tight as she bent to step into her jeans. The hospital gown went into the bin. She kept the sling. Her shirt went on slowly, one arm at a time, and when she was done, she sat on the edge of the bed for a moment and breathed and looked at the message on her phone again. "Captain Arden Hale." She typed back, "I can come out. Give me 5 minutes." The response came in under 30 seconds. "No rush. We'll be here." She found the floor nurse, signed the observation discharge against mild advice, and was given a pamphlet about rib fracture recovery that she put in her pocket without reading. Then she walked through the lobby, past the second nurse who was still watching the parking lot with wide eyes, and pushed through the glass doors into the early morning air. It was cold. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn and left the world scrubbed and gray, and the east parking lot of Garrison Valley Hospital looked like a staging ground. She counted 22 vehicles before she stopped counting. They were parked in loose, deliberate rows. Not chaotic, not military parade precise either, just organized in the particular way of people who had learned to use space efficiently and never quite stopped doing it, even when they were off duty. Most of the people standing between the vehicles were in civilian clothes, jeans, jackets, boots, but they stood the way Earl stood, that quality of stillness that read as readiness rather than rest. A woman about Sarah's age broke away from a group near the closest truck and walked toward her. She was compact, dark-haired, and moved with the kind of efficiency that made the 40 feet of asphalt between them disappear fast. "Ms. Voss," she said. "I'm Lieutenant Dara Reyes. I work with Captain Hale." She extended her hand and her grip was firm and quick. "How are you feeling?" "Like I fell on wet asphalt," Sarah said. Reyes's mouth twitched. "Fair. Captain Hale would like to speak with you. Earl's asking about you too, but he's still being looked at. We brought our own medic. He wasn't exactly cooperative with the hospital staff." A beat. "Stubborn." "I noticed," Sarah said. Reyes led her toward the center of the lot, where the largest cluster of vehicles had gathered. Sarah kept her breathing measured and her eyes moving, cataloging without being obvious about it. She was looking for structure, for hierarchy, for the subtle architecture of how these people related to each other. There was deference happening around one particular figure near the back of the group. A tall man, late 40s, standing with a cup of coffee and talking quietly with 2 others. And the way people around him adjusted their positions without looking at him was the kind of thing that only came from long practice following someone. He saw her coming and separated from the group. Captain Arden Hale was not what she had expected, though she couldn't have said precisely what she had expected. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been weathered without being hardened. Lines around the eyes from squinting in sun, a jaw that needed a shave, dark hair going gray at the temples. He held the coffee cup like he'd forgotten it was there. He looked at her with brown eyes that were measuring without being unkind. "Ms. Voss," he said, "thank you for coming out. You didn't have to." I gathered that something was happening, she said. I wanted to understand what. He nodded once, like that was the right answer. Can you walk with me for a minute? They walked toward the edge of the lot, away from the main group. Reyes fell back without being asked. Earl called me at 2:37 this morning, Hale said. He spoke without preamble, which she appreciated. We've known each other a long time. When Earl calls at 2:37 in the morning, I pick up. He took a sip of the coffee and looked out at the street beyond the lot, where the first morning traffic was beginning. He told me what happened. He told me about you. I just stepped in, Sarah said. You stepped in between 3 men and an injured veteran when you had no backup and no reason to expect any. Hale glanced at her. Earl said you covered him when he went down. Said you used your body as a shield. It seemed like the right thing to do. It was. It also could have gotten you seriously hurt. A pause. It did get you seriously hurt. She said nothing. He wasn't wrong. Here's what I need you to understand, Hale said. He stopped walking. They were at the edge of the lot now, the hospital behind them and the gray morning ahead. Earl Maddox served for 26 years, retired as a Master Chief Petty Officer, Special Operations. He's the kind of person whose name, if I said it in certain rooms, would cause people to sit up straighter. He looked at her. He's also been living quietly in Galton City for the past 3 years because that's what he wanted, and we respected that. But what happened last night, this isn't something we're walking away from. Sarah thought about this carefully. What does that mean, exactly? It means we have people pulling security footage from every camera within 4 blocks of Dusty Mile Diner right now. It means we have people who know how to make a records request move in 2 hours instead of 2 weeks. It means Bryce Calloway and the 2 men with him are going to have a very bad morning. He said it flatly, no satisfaction in it. And it means that the nurse who put herself between a boot and an old man she barely knew is going to get the follow-up she deserves, not the follow-up that Gerald Calloway's lawyer can arrange. The wind came up off the street and she felt the cold through her jacket. Her ribs tightened with it. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because you're part of it now. And because Earl asked me to. Hale looked at her with those measuring eyes. He said to tell you that people who run toward the problem instead of away from it are his kind of people. He doesn't say that often. She looked out at the lot. 22 vehicles, 60 or 70 people at least, and more had been arriving while she and Hale talked. How many people did Earl call? She said. Hale's expression shifted just slightly, something almost like amusement. Earl made 1 call, he said. To me. He turned back toward the group. The rest is the way this works. She went to see Earl. He was sitting in the back of a medical-rigged van that had been parked in the far corner of the lot, being attended by a young medic who looked like he was about 22 and was very focused on not seeming intimidated by the man in front of him. Earl had his shirt off, and she could see the bruising across his ribs and shoulder, deep and darkening, the kind that spread over several hours and always looked worse at the 12-hour mark than it did at the 6. He had a cut above his eyebrow that had been closed with steri strips. He was sitting straight despite all of it. He looked up when she climbed into the van and something moved across his face that she couldn't quite categorize. You got discharged, he said. Against mild advice, she said. You should be admitted. I've broken ribs before. He watched the medic wrap his torso. Several more times than you. That's not a competition. No, he said. It's not. She sat down across from him on the van's narrow bench seat. The medic taped the end of the bandage and said quietly, I want to check the cut again in an hour, sir. And Earl nodded without looking at him, and the medic climbed out and left them. How's the shoulder? Earl said. Reduced. Sore. She rolled it slightly, feeling the deep pull. Yours? Same side, same problem. He almost smiled. We match. She looked at him. In the gray morning light of the van, with the bruising visible and the lines of his face clear of any performance, he looked like exactly what he was. An old man who had been beaten up last night and was managing the pain of it with the particular stubbornness of someone who had learned to work through worse. Not invulnerable, just practiced. Who is Master Chief Earl Maddox? She said. I was quiet for a moment. Someone who did a lot of things a long time ago that he's not going to list for you, he said, and someone who's been trying to stay out of the way since. Hale said your name carries weight. Hale is loyal, Earl said. Sometimes it makes him generous with descriptions. He looked at his hands, which were resting on his knees. The knuckles were swollen. I wasn't always easy to serve with. I was good at the mission. I was not always good at the people around the mission. It took me a long time to learn the difference. She hadn't expected that. She sat with it for a second. I had a feeling there was more to you than chicken fried steak and motorcycle maintenance, she said. This time he did smile, brief and real. Best peach pie I've ever had at that diner, too. Walt will be glad to hear it. The smile faded. Earl looked at her steadily. You could have been seriously hurt last night. You understood that going in? Yes? But you went anyway. Yes. I need to understand why, he said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking, like it mattered to him to have the right answer. She thought about it seriously because it deserved a serious answer. I've spent the last 8 months watching things happen to people and not being in a position to do anything about them. I watched my unit get cut, and good nurses lose their jobs, and patients get shuffled around because of budget decisions made by people who have never been on a hospital floor at 3 in the morning. She looked at her hands. And then I watched you go down on that pavement, and I couldn't stand there. I couldn't be one more person who looked away. She paused. It probably wasn't the smartest thing I've ever done. No, Earl agreed. It wasn't. But I'd do it again. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, like he'd made a decision. I know you would, he said. The morning moved faster than Sarah expected things to move. At 7:15, Lieutenant Reyes came to find her with a tablet in her hand, and the particular expression of someone who had been awake all night and was running on purpose rather than energy. We've got the footage, Reyes said. She turned the tablet so Sarah could see. The image was from the gas station security camera across Route 9, grainy and rain-obscured but functional, shot at an angle that caught most of the diner's east parking lot. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. It showed everything. Sarah watched it with her arms crossed and her jaw set. The angle was imperfect, but the footage was clear enough. Bryce Calloway's first kick at Earl's motorcycle, clear and unprovoked. The shove. Earl going down. And then Sarah herself, coming through the diner's side exit and crossing the lot and putting herself between the boot and the man on the ground. And then what followed, all of it, for 4 minutes and 32 seconds, until the police cruiser's lights had appeared at the lot's entrance and the 3 men had walked unhurried to their car. We have 2 additional cameras, Reyes said, one from the ATM 2 lots down, one from a traffic camera on the Route 9 intersection. Combined, there's no angle of the incident that isn't covered. She paused. Mr. Calloway's vehicle is registered. His companions are identified. We've been in contact with the Galton City PD detective assigned to the case since 4 a.m. Sarah looked up from the tablet. The detective is working with you? The detective was very cooperative once the footage was provided, Reyes said carefully. And once he understood who was involved. What does that mean for the timeline? Calloway and his 2 companions were taken in for questioning at 6:40 this morning. Reyes's voice was neutral, professional. The assault charges were filed at 7:02. Sarah stared at her. She had been in the hospital for the better part of 3 hours and had eaten 5 stale crackers and been awake for 26 hours. And somehow, in that time, the things she had fully expected to take months had been compressed into a single overnight. She felt something shift in her chest that wasn't the cracked ribs. How? She said. Evidence, Reyes said, simply. Clear, documented, time-stamped evidence presented by people who know how to present it. That's all it is. She took the tablet back. Mr. Calloway reportedly was not pleased to find the detective waiting for him at his home at 6:30 in the morning. Sarah thought about Bryce Calloway's certain, comfortable voice in the rain. Nobody's going to lose a night of sleep over it. I want to be clear about something, she said. Earl's motorcycle. They damaged it before the assault started. That was the beginning of all of this. It's documented, Reyes said. All of it. The repair costs are part of the filing. Sarah nodded. She looked out at the parking lot, which had settled into a quieter kind of activity. People moving with purpose, vehicles repositioning, the whole operation shifting into a different gear now that the immediate night was over. The morning light was stronger now, still gray but warmer, and the city was waking up around them. She had not let herself feel the full weight of the night before, because there hadn't been time, and because her body was managing its own damage. But standing here in the morning, with the footage still visible in her peripheral memory and the reality of what had happened settling in, she felt the exhaustion move through her like a tide. The shoulder, the ribs, the long dark weight in the hospital bed. The singular cold weight of lying on wet asphalt while Bryce Calloway told her that nobody was coming. She had believed him, a little. Some part of her had been waiting for the part where he turned out to be right, the way that things had been turning out for the last 8 months. The interviews that didn't call back, the apartment she'd lost, the unit that had been cut, and the skills that suddenly had nowhere to go. She had learned in those 8 months to expect the realistic outcome, which was usually the quiet one where nothing happened and the people with money and fathers on planning commissions went home and slept fine. She had been wrong about that. The knowledge of it sat in her sternum like a small, strange, foreign weight. At 8:40, Gerald Calloway arrived. She heard about it before she saw it, a ripple of changed attention moving through the people in the lot, a subtle adjustment of posture and position, heads turning. Reyes appeared at Sarah's elbow. Calloway's father is at the hospital's main entrance, she said. He's asking for the officer in charge. Of what? He's not specific, Reyes said, but he came with a lawyer. Sarah looked toward the main entrance. From the east lot, she could see the front of the hospital at an angle, the wide glass doors, the circular drive. A dark car had stopped in the drive. 2 men were getting out, and even from this distance, the body language of one of them was identifiable. The entitled forward lean, the suit that said this is a serious inconvenience, the kind of posture that had learned to fill space as a statement of consequence. "Where's Hale?" she said. "Coming," Reyes said. Hale appeared from between 2 vehicles, still carrying the coffee cup. She suspected it was a different coffee by now, but she wasn't certain. He stopped next to Sarah and looked at the main entrance for a moment. "Gerald Calloway," he said. "His lawyer, too," Reyes confirmed. Hale was quiet for a moment. He sipped the coffee. "Okay," he said. He handed the cup to Reyes with the air of a man setting something aside. "Ms. Voss." She looked at him. "You don't have to come for this part," he said, "but you're welcome to." She pulled her jacket straight against the sling. Her ribs complained with the movement, a sharp, specific line of pain that she breathed through and set aside. "I'm coming," she said. They walked across the lot and through the hospital's side entrance, through the lobby, and out through the main entrance doors. And Gerald Calloway turned to look at them with the flat expectation of a man who was used to being met by people who wanted to placate him. Gerald was in his late 50s, built the way his son was built, with the same jaw and the same eyes, and none of the youth that made Bryce merely unpleasant rather than calculated. He had the kind of face that knew its own power and had stopped being interesting about it. The lawyer was already speaking. "My client's son was taken in for questioning under what appear to be significantly irregular circumstances, and we intend—" "Your client's son assaulted a 63-year-old veteran and the woman who tried to protect him in the parking lot of a diner," Hale said. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. "He was taken in for questioning because there is clear, multi-angle footage of the assault, which has been provided to the Galton City PD detective of record, along with documentation of criminal property damage." Gerald Calloway's eyes moved to Hale's face, and something flickered in them. Not fear, not yet. Recalibration. "And who are you?" Gerald said. Hale looked at him for a moment. "Someone who knows Earl Maddox," he said. The name landed. Sarah was watching Gerald Calloway's face closely enough to see it. A small tightening, almost invisible. The kind of reaction you had when a word resolved into a specific meaning you hadn't expected to encounter. He knew the name. She hadn't been sure he would. He did. "My son," Gerald began. "Your son kicked an injured man and dragged a woman across wet asphalt by the arm," Hale said. "The evidence is complete. The charges are filed." He looked at Gerald without any particular hostility, which was somehow more effective than hostility would have been. "Your lawyer is welcome to review the case documentation. That's how this works now." Gerald Calloway's jaw was tight. The lawyer was already touching his arm, already murmuring something low and calibrating. But Gerald was looking at Hale with those recalibrated eyes, and then his gaze moved to Sarah, and she saw the moment he understood who she was. "You're the waitress," he said. "I'm the trauma nurse," she said. I was working a second job. He looked at her. She looked back. She was exhausted and her ribs hurt and her shoulder was a specific background noise of wrong, and she had been awake for close to 27 hours. And she looked back at Gerald Calloway without flinching because she had made her choices last night in the rain and she had meant them, and she was not going to stand here in the morning light and pretend otherwise. Gerald turned back to his lawyer. They spoke for a moment, low, and then he turned back. "This isn't resolved," he said. "No," Hale agreed. "It's not. Not yet." Gerald and his lawyer returned to the car. Sarah watched it pull out of the drive. Hale stood beside her and watched it too. "He knows the name," she said. "Most people who've been around this city for 30 years in the position he's in know the name," Hale said. "Whether they know what it means is a different question." She turned to look at him. "What does it mean? What did Earl actually do?" Hale was quiet for a moment. He seemed to be deciding something. "Earl Maddox spent 26 years in environments that most people don't know exist," he said. "He trained people who now run programs that are classified at levels I don't have full clearance for. There are decisions made by people in rooms you and I will never sit in that are better because of things Earl did 20 years ago." He paused. "He would never tell you any of this. He'd tell you he just fixed machinery and followed orders." "He said he wasn't always good at the people around the mission," Sarah said. Hale looked at her with something that might have been surprise. "He said that to you?" "This morning." Hale was quiet for a moment. "Earl doesn't say that to people." He looked back at the drive where Calloway's car had been. "He must have meant what he said about you." By 11 in the morning, the situation had shifted in ways she hadn't anticipated. It started when Reyes found her sitting on a bench outside the hospital's east entrance, eating a vending machine sandwich that was aggressively mediocre, and said, with the particular neutrality of someone delivering information they knew would land hard, "Garrison Valley Hospital has been informed of the incident. The board is apparently discussing it." Sarah looked up. "Why would the hospital board care about an assault in a diner parking lot?" "Because the assault was connected to Earl Maddox," Reyes said. "And because Earl Maddox's former unit apparently includes 3 people who currently sit on the hospital's philanthropic advisory committee." She paused. "And because 2 of those people made calls this morning." The sandwich was in her hand and she was not eating it anymore. "What kind of calls?" she said. "The kind that result in hospital boards discussing things quickly." Reyes sat down next to her. "Sarah, I want to be straightforward with you. What happened last night is becoming something larger than a parking lot assault. The Calloway family has more connections in this city than just the Planning Commission, and the way the legal situation moves from here is going to depend on how much pressure can be maintained on it." She looked at her directly. "Earl's community can maintain that pressure, but you're going to need to be willing to be visible for a while, to give statements, to not disappear back into the overnight shift and let this quietly go away." Sarah put the sandwich down on the bench. She had spent 8 months trying to be small, to take up less space, to not make her situation anyone else's problem. She had been good at it. She had gotten smaller and quieter and more efficient, until the only evidence of who she used to be was the muscle memory that made her run toward trouble in parking lots. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Reyes nodded. "Good." She stood up. "There's one more thing. The detective on the case, his name is Abramson. He'd like to speak with you again this afternoon, and he mentioned—" She stopped and her expression did something complicated. "What?" Sarah said. "He mentioned that the security footage shows a moment just before Calloway's jacket tore, where the men have you down on the ground." Reyes's voice was careful. "And he said that when Earl stood up from that, the way he stood up, Abramson had to watch it twice because he thought the camera had cut to different footage. He said it didn't look like a 63-year-old man who'd just taken a beating." Sarah was very still. She thought about the moment in the parking lot. Earl's voice. The shift in frequency, the way he'd said "step back" and the word had landed in the air like a command rather than a request. "What does that mean?" she said carefully. Reyes met her eyes. "It means Detective Abramson, who has been a cop for 22 years, said he wanted to know more about Earl Maddox before he closed the evidentiary phase." A pause. "And it means that this morning, before the Calloways lawyered up, Bryce Calloway told the detective something." "What did he say?" Reyes was quiet for a moment that was exactly 1 beat too long. "He said that when Earl stood up, one of his friends, the one closest to him, took 3 steps back without being touched." She looked at Sarah steadily. He said the man looked at Earl's face and just moved away from him, and that nobody told him to. The morning air was cold, and the hospital was quiet behind them, and somewhere in the parking lot, 22 vehicles were still parked with the patience of people who had nowhere else to be. Sarah thought about Earl's dark, calm eyes, and the way they'd looked at Bryce Calloway like a problem that had already been solved. She thought about the insignia she'd seen through the torn jacket lining, not long enough to read, just long enough to recognize that it mattered. She thought about what Hale had said. Whether they know what it means is a different question. "What did the insignia say?" she said. "Under the jacket. I saw it when the collar tore." Reyes looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached into her jacket pocket, took out a folded piece of paper, and held it out. Sarah unfolded it. It was a printout, a photograph of a military patch. The design was formal and specific, the kind of thing that was not decorative. Beneath it, in small text, was a unit designation she didn't recognize, and then a line of text that she read twice to make sure she was understanding correctly. The blood moved strangely in her hands. "This is what Earl Maddox wore under his jacket," she said. "Yes," Reyes said. "And Bryce Calloway tore this open in the parking lot of a roadside diner in Galton City." "Yes." She looked up from the paper. "He has no idea what he did." "No," Reyes said. "He doesn't, but he's starting to find out." Sarah folded the paper carefully and held it in both hands and looked out at the gray November morning, and somewhere across the city, in a room with better lighting than this bench deserved, a lawyer was trying to explain to Bryce Calloway why the morning had gone the way it had, and Gerald Calloway was making his own calls. And the machine that had always protected his family from consequence was trying to engage in the way it always did. But Detective Abramson was already watching the footage for a third time, and in the east lot behind the hospital, 70 people were still exactly where they had been, and Earl Maddox was in a medical van having his cut checked again, and somewhere in Galton City, a DA's office was getting a set of documents delivered by hand rather than email, because some things moved faster when you knew the right people. And the insignia on the paper in Sarah Voss's hand meant that a lot of people in a lot of places were about to know exactly what Bryce Calloway had done, and to whom and with how little thought, and the number of people who were going to be motivated to ensure consequences for that was considerably larger than anything Gerald Calloway's lawyer had yet factored into his morning. Sarah's phone buzzed. "Unknown number." She answered. "Ms. Voss?" The voice was male, clipped, professional. "My name is Special Agent Darren Polk. I'm calling from the Federal Field Office in Denver. I'd like to speak with you at your earliest convenience regarding last night's incident." A pause. "We've been in contact with Captain Hale. We have some questions about the individual who initiated the attack, specifically regarding certain activities separate from last night's assault." She stood up from the bench slowly. "What kind of activities?" she said. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Ms. Voss," Special Agent Polk said, "how familiar are you with the Calloway Development Group's current city contracts?" She had no answer for that. None. The question made no sense to her in the context of a parking lot fight. Unless it wasn't just a parking lot fight. Unless Bryce Calloway hitting Earl Maddox's motorcycle and shoving an old veteran to the ground on a rainy November night hadn't been random at all. The thought hit her like cold water. "I'm available now," she said. Special Agent Polk was staying at a Federal Field satellite office that Sarah hadn't known existed, a nondescript suite on the 4th floor of a building downtown that had a tax preparation company on the ground floor and a dentist on the second, which she suspected was either a deliberate choice or the federal government's idea of camouflage. Reyes drove her. They didn't talk much on the way, which suited Sarah fine because her ribs hurt when the car went over uneven road and Galton City's east side had not been repaved recently. The suite had 3 desks, 2 of which were occupied, a wall-mounted monitor showing a map of the city with several marked points, and a coffee machine that smelled like it had been running since the previous administration. Polk was younger than his voice had suggested, mid-30s, close-cropped hair, a face that was careful in the deliberate way of someone trained to show only what they intended. He shook her hand and offered her a chair that was marginally more comfortable than the hospital bench, and he sat across from her and put a folder on the table between them and left it closed. "I appreciate you coming," he said. "You implied it was important," Sarah said. "It is." He looked at her for a moment. "How much do you know about Calloway Development Group?" Gerald Calloway owns commercial property in downtown Galton City and sits on the planning commission, she said. Beyond that, nothing. Polk opened the folder. He turned it so she could see the first page. A property map, Galton City, with a cluster of parcels marked in red along the Route 9 corridor. Callaway Development Group has been in an extended bid process for a city-funded infrastructure contract, approximately $42 million of road and commercial zone development along the eastern Route 9 expansion. He tapped the map. The bid has been contested. There's a competing proposal from a regional development coalition that offered better terms. The selection committee has been deadlocked for 4 months. Sarah looked at the map. The marked parcels formed a corridor. A long, specific corridor that included, she looked more closely, the block where Dusty Mile Diner sat. The block where Earl Maddox parked his motorcycle every Thursday night. Earl's property, she said. Earl doesn't own property on that block, Polk said. But he knows someone who does. A woman named Bettina Suarez, ma'am. She owns the building the diner operates out of, along with 2 adjacent lots. She's been contacted by Callaway Development 3 times in the past 8 months to sell. She's declined each time. He paused. Ms. Suarez is Earl Maddox's sister-in-law. Earl has been informally advising her on the offers. The morning reorganized itself around this information. So Bryce Callaway didn't randomly pick a fight with an old man over a motorcycle, Sarah said slowly. We're not prepared to make that characterization as fact, Polk said carefully. What we can say is that Bryce Callaway knew who Earl Maddox was in relation to the Route 9 property dispute, because the Callaway Development Group's legal team had researched every party connected to the Suarez properties when she declined the 3rd offer. He looked at her steadily. Whether what happened in that parking lot was deliberate provocation, a drunk rich kid making a bad decision, or something in between is what we're working to establish. And if it was deliberate? Then the assault charge becomes part of a larger picture that includes potential intimidation of a party in a contract dispute connected to city funds. He said it with the flatness of someone who had laid out this kind of sentence many times before, which is a different category of problem for the Callaway family. Sarah sat back. Her shoulder pulled with the movement and she adjusted, pressing her elbow against her side. The ribs were a constant low hum now, the kind of pain that became background once you accepted it was staying. What do you need from me? Your account of the incident. Specifically, he turned to the next page in the folder, a still image pulled from the gas station footage. Whether at any point Bryce Callaway or either of his companions mentioned the diner property, Ms. Suarez, or the Route 9 development. She thought back. The parking lot, the rain, the sequence of it. Bryce crouching down next to her, the certainty in his voice. Nothing specific, she said. He told me nobody was going to come for either of us. He told me nobody would care. She paused. He was very confident about that. More confident than someone who had just randomly gotten into a fight would be, I think. Like he'd already thought through the aftermath. Polk made a note. Anything else? He said... She stopped, replaying it. He said, your little act of heroism is just going to end with you in the same ditch as this old man. He used the word old man specifically, not his name, which means he knew Earl was older, which means he'd seen him before, or he'd been told. Polk looked up from his notes. His careful face shifted slightly. You have good recall. Trauma nurse, she said. I spent 6 years doing assessments under pressure. You learn to retain what you hear. He made another note. Ms. Voss, one more question. He set the pen down. In your time speaking with Earl Maddox last night and this morning, did he indicate to you whether he was aware that the Callaway family had researched him in connection with the property dispute? She thought about Earl in the van, his hands on his knees, the bruising visible and the pain managed. I've been trying to stay out of the way. No, she said. But I think he suspected something. The way he reacted in the parking lot. He wasn't surprised to be targeted. He was angry about it, but he wasn't surprised. Polk nodded slowly. He closed the folder. Thank you, he said. We may need a formal statement in the next day or two. Is that manageable? Yes, she said. He stood, and she stood, and she was almost to the door when he said, Ms. Voss. She turned. What you did in that parking lot. I've read the incident report and I've seen the footage. He wasn't being warm exactly. His face was still professional, but there was something direct in it. You made a decision with bad odds and you held to it. That matters in how this develops, because it means there's a witness who stayed present and remembers clearly. A pause. A lot of people wouldn't have stayed. She thought about the people in the diner who had looked through the windows and not come out. I know, she said, and she left. Reyes was waiting in the car. She had coffee, 2 cups, and she handed one to Sarah without comment, which was the right call. They sat in the parked car for a moment while Sarah processed what she'd just heard, and the coffee was too hot to drink, but warm in her hands. Did you know, Sarah said, about the property dispute? Earl mentioned it to Hale this morning, Reyes said. Hale mentioned it to Polk. She was looking out the windshield. Earl's been trying to keep Bettina Suarez's situation quiet because he didn't want it to become a pressure point. It became a pressure point anyway. Yes, Reyes started the car. That's the thing about keeping things quiet. Sometimes the other side's already figured out where to push. They drove back toward the hospital, and Sarah watched the city go past. The downtown blocks she'd driven through for 8 months without really seeing them. The Route 9 commercial strip with its diner and its gas station and its shuttered hardware store. The Eastern Expansion Zone, where the marked parcels on Polk's map sat behind chain link and construction signage. She thought about Bettina Suarez declining 3 offers, and Earl quietly helping her understand why she was right to. She thought about Gerald Calloway, whose family had spent 30 years building influence in this city, deciding that an old veteran and his sister-in-law were a problem to be solved. She thought about Bryce Calloway's boot and the sound it had made when it connected with her shoulder, and the complete, comfortable certainty in his voice when he told her nobody was coming. Her phone rang. Number she didn't recognize, Colorado area code. Voss, she answered. Ms. Voss, this is Nora Belkin. I'm the administrator at Garrison Valley Hospital. The voice was precise, the kind of precise that came from decades of managing institutional relationships. I'd like to speak with you in person, if you have time this morning. Sarah looked at Reyes, who was watching the road. About what? She said. About your employment background and a position we have open in our emergency trauma unit, Belkin said. And about your experience last night. A pause. Both things are connected. I'll explain when we meet, if you're willing. Sarah was quiet for a moment. 8 months, 6 applications. 3 interviews that didn't call back. The 4th place that wanted administrative experience. When? She said. 11:30, if that works. My office is on the 3rd floor. I'll be there, Sarah said. She hung up. Reyes glanced at her. Hospital administrator? Reyes said. You heard that? Car's quiet. She didn't apologize for it. Garrison Valley has been trying to build out their trauma unit for 2 years. They lost their lead trauma nurse to Crestfield's expansion program 18 months ago and haven't adequately replaced her. Sarah stared at her. How do you know that? Reyes's expression was carefully neutral. Earl asked us to look into your situation this morning before he would let the medic check his ribs. The city moved past the windows. Sarah sat with this information and what it meant. That Earl Maddox, 63 years old, bruised and hurting in the back of a medical van before the sun was fully up, had made her employment situation part of what he'd asked people to look into. Before his own health. Before anything else. She pressed her lips together and looked out the window. And she was not going to cry in a car driven by a lieutenant she'd met 4 hours ago, so she breathed through it and let the feelings settle where feelings went when they had nowhere immediate to go. He didn't have to do that, she said. No, Reyes agreed. He didn't. Nora Belkin was in her early 60s, small, with white hair cut practically short, and the kind of eyes that had spent decades reading rooms and people inside them. Her office was neat in the way of someone who was genuinely organized rather than performing it, and she had water and a small plate of actual food waiting when Sarah came in, which Sarah noticed and which Belkin noticed her noticing. You've been awake a long time, Belkin said. Eat. Sarah ate. The food was better than the vending machine sandwich. She didn't make conversation about it. I'll be direct, Belkin said, sitting across from her with a folder of her own. Garrison Valley has 2 open positions in our emergency trauma unit. One is a floor nurse position, high acuity, overnight and rotation. The other is a team lead position that has been open for 11 months, which I will be honest with you has been difficult to fill because we lost the person who previously held it under circumstances that reflected badly on how this hospital managed a personnel disagreement. She set the folder down. Your record at Crestfield Regional is available to me through the standard credentialing channels. It is, and I'm not saying this for effect, one of the strongest performance records I've seen come out of that unit in the past 5 years. Sarah was still. Crestfield let me go in a staffing cut. Yes, Belkin said. I'm aware of how they structured that round of cuts. I'm also aware that your unit was not the only one that lost people whose performance records did not justify the loss. Her voice was level and not unkind. I cannot speak to what Crestfield decided and why. I can tell you what I'm deciding and why. Why now? Sarah said, not accusing, needing to understand. Yesterday you didn't know I existed. Belkin looked at her directly. Because 3 members of my hospital's philanthropic advisory committee called me this morning and told me what happened last night. Because one of them, a man named Hale, told me that the nurse who put herself between Earl Maddox and a boot at 2 in the morning had spent the last 8 months being overlooked by a system that should have caught her. She paused. And because I watched the footage myself at 9 this morning, and what I saw was not a woman acting on impulse. What I saw was someone making a clinical decision about a patient, covering the point of impact, managing the fall, staying physically between the threat and the injured party. She folded her hands on the desk. That's training. That's professional instinct. Sarah looked at the water glass in her hand. It was very cold. I can't start immediately. I have injuries from last night and I need to... I know, Belkin said. I'm not asking you to start tomorrow. I'm asking you to consider starting when you're able. A pause. I'm also asking you to understand that this offer is not charity. I have a unit that needs a lead with your specific background, and the fact that you came to my attention because of what you did last night doesn't make your qualifications any less real. Sarah set the glass down. She thought about the overnight diner shifts and the $6 tips and the vending machine food and the way she had been packing herself down smaller and smaller for 8 months until she'd forgotten what it felt like to walk into a room as the person she'd trained to be. Can I have until tomorrow to give you an answer? She said. Take the time you need, Belkin said. So, back at the hospital's east lot, the midday situation had shifted again. Half the vehicles were gone, deployed somewhere, reorganized, Reyes explained vaguely. But Hale was still there, and Earl had been moved from the medical van to a chair someone had brought out and set up in the lot's partial sun with the practicality of people who had decided a concession to comfort was acceptable. He had a jacket on over the bandaging. He looked better than he had at 5 in the morning, which was a low bar but real progress. Sarah sat down next to him. Garrison Valley offered me the trauma lead position, she said. Earl looked at her sideways. And? I told her I needed a day to think about it. She paused. Polk told me about the Route 9 properties, about Bettina. Earl's jaw tightened slightly. Polk talks. He needed information. He shared information. That's how interviews work. She looked at him. Why didn't you tell me? Because you didn't need the background to decide to step in, Earl said, and because it wasn't your business yet. It's my business now, she said. I've given a formal statement that's going to be part of a federal inquiry into potential contract intimidation, which means that whatever Bryce Calloway was or wasn't trying to do last night, I'm now officially part of the situation. She waited. So tell me about Bettina. He was quiet for a moment. The sun came and went behind a cloud. In the lot, Hale was talking on his phone 10 yards away, too far to hear. My wife's sister, Earl said. Margot passed 4 years ago. Bettina owns the diner property and 2 adjacent lots. She's 61, she runs the building herself, and she has no interest in selling to people who are going to tear it down and build a strip mall. He said it plainly, without sentiment. Calloway's been pressuring her, not overtly, not in ways that are easy to document, the kind of pressure that's small things. Delays on permits, noise complaints filed against the building. One of her tenants, the hardware store, got a surprise inspection that found 3 violations that had apparently been invisible for 11 years. Sarah thought about the shuttered hardware store 2 lots from the diner. The hardware store closed, she said, 4 months ago. Earl's voice was flat. They couldn't sustain the fines and the legal costs while the violations were being disputed. They closed. He looked at his hands. Bettina lost 20% of her rental income. She's been managing, but Calloway knows she's managing. The 4th offer they sent her was lower than the 3rd, not higher. They're waiting her out. And you've been advising her to hold. The city contract decision goes to a committee vote in 6 weeks, he said. If the competing bid wins, Callaway's entire expansion strategy for that corridor collapses. There's no incentive for him to develop those parcels on his own at the price he'd need to pay Bettina. He paused. If she can hold for 6 weeks, the pressure dissolves with the contract. Sarah thought about this, about the timeline, about Bryce Callaway in that parking lot 11 days before a preliminary committee review. Polk thinks it might not have been random, she said. I know what Polk thinks, Earl said. I'm not sure Bryce Callaway is strategic enough for it to have been deliberate in any sophisticated sense. But Gerald Callaway is. And Gerald Callaway's son knew who I was and knew where I had dinner on Thursday nights. He stopped. Whether Gerald told him to do something about it, or whether the kid just got drunk and made a bad decision in a place where he knew I'd be, I don't know. The outcome was the same either way. The cloud moved off. The sun came back thin and November cold. 6 weeks, Sarah said. 6 weeks. She looked at the space between her boots on the asphalt and thought about what 6 weeks of sustained pressure looked like, and what Gerald Callaway's lawyer was doing right now, and how quickly Bryce's assault charge could be bargained down if the federal inquiry stalled or the evidence was questioned or Sarah Voss went back to her overnight diner shift and became a witness who was easy to discount. She also thought about Nora Belkin's folder and her white hair and her steady eyes. What I saw was someone making a clinical decision about a patient. She pulled out her phone, found Belkin's number from the missed call log, typed, I'd like to accept the position. I'll come in Thursday to do the paperwork. She hit send before she could think about it too long. Earl was watching her. Garrison Valley, she said. I'm taking the job. He said nothing, but something in the set of his jaw changed just slightly in the way of a man who had expected this answer and was still, quietly, relieved to hear it. The Callaway family's first substantive legal countermove arrived at 2:47 that afternoon. Hale came to find her where she'd been sitting with Earl, and his face had a new quality to it. Not alarm, but a kind of focused attention that she was beginning to recognize as his version of concern. Gerald Callaway's lawyer filed a motion 2 hours ago, Hale said. They're challenging the chain of custody on the security footage, claiming the footage was obtained outside proper law enforcement channels and requesting it be excluded from evidentiary consideration. Sarah looked at him. Can they do that? They can file, Hale said. Whether it succeeds is a different question. The footage was provided to Detective Abramson by the business owner of the gas station voluntarily, which is standard. But the Callaway legal team is arguing that its subsequent distribution, to Polk's office, to us, constituted irregular handling. That's a delay tactic, Earl said. He hadn't moved from his chair. His voice was even. Yes, Hale said, but it's a legitimate one if they can make it stick. And it forces the prosecution to spend time and resources defending the chain of custody before they can actually use the footage. He looked at Sarah. It also means the timeline moves. If the footage is tied up in a motion hearing, the assault charges become harder to sustain quickly, which means Bryce Callaway is out of custody while the motion is pending. Sarah processed this. He's been released? On bail, this morning. Hale's voice was carefully flat. His father posted it before we were back from the hospital. She had known this was possible. She hadn't thought about it concretely, and knowing it concretely was different. She thought about Bryce Callaway out in the city somewhere, while the legal machinery ground slowly through its motions, and Gerald Callaway in his office pulling on threads. And 6 weeks until a committee vote that the whole shape of this thing seemed to hinge on. There's something else, Hale said. She waited. Walt Okafor called Reyes an hour ago. He says someone came into the diner this morning. Civilian, no identification offered. Told Walt that he'd heard there might be compensation available for businesses that experienced disruption related to the Route 9 development project. He paused. Walt said the man left a card. The card has a Callaway Development Group contact number on it. The three of them were quiet for a moment. They're moving fast, Earl said. They're scared, Hale said. Gerald Callaway's lawyer doesn't file a chain of custody motion on footage this clear unless someone has told him the federal angle is real. And if the federal angle is real, the contract dispute and the assault are connected, and that changes the exposure significantly. So they're trying to contain it, Sarah said. The footage challenge buys time. The visit to Walt is, what? A warning? An offer? Probably both, Hale said. Walt's a sensible man. He's also the person who called 911 last night, so he's a witness of record. A pause. He did not take the card. Sarah thought about Walt, who had not come out of the diner, who had called 911 and watched through the window and felt whatever he'd felt about that. She thought about the card and what it meant that it had appeared at the diner the morning after. This is going to get more complicated before it gets simpler, she said. Yes, Hale agreed. He was looking at her with those measuring brown eyes. How are you holding up? She had cracked ribs and a shoulder that was going to need a week before she could lift anything, and she'd been awake since yesterday afternoon. And in the last 12 hours, she had given 2 statements, received a job offer, learned that the parking lot fight might be the edge of something much larger, and watched a legal team try to chip away at the only clear evidence of what had happened to her. I'm fine, she said. Earl looked at her. That's not what I asked, Hale said. She almost smiled. I'm tired. I'm in pain. I'm also not going anywhere. She looked at Hale, then at Earl. You said 6 weeks to the vote. What does the next 6 weeks look like if the Calloway family keeps doing this? Hale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, It looks like a fight. Okay, she said. I've been in fights. It was the truth. The specific kind of fight she was describing was not the parking lot kind. It was the slow, grinding kind, with lawyers and documentation and public exposure and the constant pressure of money working against you. But she had spent 6 years in high-acuity trauma units, which were their own kind of sustained crisis management, and she had learned something fundamental in those years. The outcome wasn't determined at the beginning. It was determined by who stayed in the room when things got bad. She intended to stay in the room. Hale nodded. He pulled out his phone, looked at something on it. His expression shifted. What? Sarah said. He turned the phone toward her. It was a news alert. Local Galton City outlet, timestamp 40 minutes ago. The headline read, Prominent developer's son cited in assault of local veteran. Federal sources confirm inquiry into Route 9 contract process. She read it twice. That's fast. Someone talked, Earl said. His voice was neutral, but she heard the edge under it. The city reporter has sources in the PD, Hale said. This was going to come out. The question is what comes next. He took the phone back. Gerald Calloway's media team has already released a statement. I'm told it describes last night's incident as a minor altercation being blown out of proportion and expresses full confidence in the legal process. Sarah thought about the phrase minor altercation. She thought about the specific feeling of wet asphalt against her cheekbone. They're going to try to make us the story, she said. Not the assault, not the contract, us, the optics. Who showed up, why, what it looks like. Yes, Hale said. So what's our answer to that? Hale and Earl exchanged a look she couldn't fully read. Then Hale said, Earl has a call scheduled with someone at 2 of the local television stations, former colleagues. He was going to keep it quiet, but don't keep it quiet, Sarah said. Both men looked at her. She was surprised by her own certainty, but it was there, real and specific. Calloway's strategy is to delay until it's quiet and contained. Everything they're doing, the motion, the visit to Walt, the statement calling it minor, it's all designed to reduce visibility until the committee vote passes, and this is just a resolved court case nobody is paying attention to. She looked at Hale. So we don't let it go quiet. Earl was watching her with those dark, calm eyes. You'd be willing to talk to the press, he said. It wasn't a question. I'm a nurse who was beaten in a parking lot for stepping in front of someone's boot, she said. I'm also a nurse who lost her job 8 months ago and has been working overnight diner shifts while a hospital 11 minutes away had a trauma lead position open. She paused. Those are not complicated stories. Those are the kind of stories that don't need a spokesperson. The sun had moved while they talked. It was coming in lower now, the afternoon light at an angle, and in it Earl Maddox looked like exactly what he was. A man who had spent a lifetime in hard places and had come to a small city to be quiet, and had found that quiet broken by someone who thought quiet meant weak. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. There's one condition, Hale said. I was looking at his phone again. Something in his expression had changed, quickly, the way faces changed when a message arrived that shifted the weight of things. What? Earl said. Hale turned the phone toward them both. It was not a news alert this time. It was a message from Reyes sent 3 minutes ago. Abramson just called. He pulled the full footage from the ATM camera. The angle we didn't see before. I'm sending it now. You need to look at this before the press call, both of you. Then, below that, a single attached image, a still frame from the ATM camera, timestamped 11:52 p.m. the night before, at an angle that caught the parking lot from the northeast corner. The frame showed Bryce Calloway in profile, and standing 6 feet behind him, visible at the edge of the frame, partly obscured by the corner of a parked truck, a figure Sarah had not seen in the parking lot, a figure holding a phone, taking photographs. Not one of Bryce's companions. Someone separate, positioned deliberately, and in the corner of the frame, barely visible, the edge of something that her eyes resolved, after several seconds of looking, into the front grille of a second vehicle that had been parked behind the truck the entire time and had not appeared in any of the other footage. She looked at Earl. His face had gone very still. "You know who that is?" she said. He said nothing for a long moment. The November light came through the parking lot in long, low bars. Around them, the city was going about its afternoon, cars moving on the street, voices somewhere in the distance, ordinary November sounds that had nothing to do with what was sitting on the screen between them. "Yes," Earl said finally. "Who?" He looked at the image, then at Hale. Something passed between them, quick and significant. "His name is Fowler," Earl said. "Dane Fowler. He's the operations manager for Callaway Development Group." His voice was careful, controlled. "He's also the man who made the third offer to Bettina, in person. The one where he told her that sometimes properties had accidents when owners weren't motivated to maintain them properly." Sarah went very still. "She didn't report that?" she said. "She was scared," Earl said. He said it without inflection, but the weight under it was unmistakable. "She thought reporting it would make things worse." Sarah looked at the image again. Fowler, with his phone at the edge of the frame, positioned to document what happened. Not a bystander, not a coincidence. A witness. The Callaway side's own witness, sent to record what Bryce did and how it played out, so they'd know what they had to manage. Which meant it hadn't been a drunk rich kid making a bad decision at a roadside diner. It had been planned. And the person who planned it had been standing in the dark 12 feet away while Sarah was on the ground with Bryce Calloway's voice in her ear, certain and unhurried, telling her that nobody was coming. Her hands were very steady. She had noticed this about herself under pressure before. The hands stayed steady, even when everything else was running hot. She pressed them flat against her knees and breathed through the ribs and looked at the image on Hale's phone and thought with complete clarity about what this meant and what had to happen next. "We need to get that image to Polk," she said. "Now. Before the press call. Before anything else. Because if Fowler was there documenting it, there's a chain that goes from him to Gerald Calloway, and that chain makes this not an assault by a drunk kid." She looked at Hale. "That makes it a conspiracy." Hale was already dialing. Earl was looking at the image. He was very quiet. She watched his face, and she saw something in it she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled stillness he'd been maintaining since the van. Not the managed calm. Something older and more specific. The face of a man who had just confirmed something he had hoped he was wrong about. "Earl," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Bettina," she said. "Is she safe right now?" The pause that followed was exactly 1 second too long. I was already reaching for his own phone when the call connected on Hale's end, and in the middle of the parking lot on a cold November afternoon, with the sun going down at its November angle and the city carrying on around them, 2 phone calls happened simultaneously, and the shape of what had started in a diner parking lot the night before became something considerably larger and more dangerous than anyone standing in the lot that morning had understood it to be. Bettina Suarez answered on the second ring. Earl had the phone to his ear and his eyes on the middle distance, and Sarah watched his face go through 3 seconds of absolute stillness before he said, "You're home. Good. Stay there." A pause. "I know. I'll explain later. Don't open the door for anyone who isn't me or Hale, you understand?" Another pause, longer. "Bettina, listen to me. I know you're scared. That's exactly right. Stay inside." He hung up. His hand dropped to his knee and he sat with it for a moment. and Sarah could see the specific quality of a man managing more than pain. "She's fine," he said. "She saw a car parked outside her building this afternoon. Didn't recognize it. It left after an hour." "Fowler?" Sarah said. "Or someone he sent?" Earl stood from the chair, carefully, one hand on the armrest, and the movement cost him. She could see it in the compression of his jaw. But he was up. "Hale." Hale was still on his call with Polk, but he'd been watching. He held up one finger, spoke 2 more sentences into the phone, and hung up. "Polk's getting a protective detail on Bettina Suarez within the hour," Hale said. "Federal, not city. Given the conspiracy framing, he can justify it." He looked at Earl. "She needs to give a formal statement about the third offer and what Fowler said to her." "She'll give it," Earl said. "She was afraid before because she thought nothing would come of it. That's changed." The afternoon had gone fully cold, the November sun below the rooflines now, and the temperature dropping in that particular way that meant it was going to be a hard night. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter with her good arm. Her ribs had settled into the kind of constant background ache that meant they were managing her rather than the other way around, which she accepted with the pragmatism of a person who had no alternative. "What does Polk need from the ATM image?" she said. "Authentication of the timestamp and chain of custody, which the ATM's owner can provide. Identification of Fowler from a source independent of Earl, which Abramson can get from city business licensing records. Callaway Development Group has permitted projects. Fowler is listed as operations manager on 3 of them." Hale scrolled on his phone. "And the partial vehicle in the corner of the frame. Reyes is running the grill line against registered vehicle types. If we can narrow the make and model, combined with the location, we can request traffic camera data from the Route 9 intersection for that time window, and potentially get a plate." Sarah looked at him. "How long for all of that?" "The vehicle ID, a few hours. The traffic camera data, we need a formal request, which means tomorrow morning at the earliest." He looked at her steadily. "Which is why the press call matters. The Callaway side filed their legal motion this morning because they expected this to be manageable. If this becomes a public story with named facts and identified parties before the motion hearing, the calculus changes." She thought about this, about what it meant to take something out of the contained space of legal proceedings and put it in front of people who had no particular reason to protect Gerald Callaway's interests. "When is the press call?" she said. 6 o'clock. 2 local stations and the regional print outlet have confirmed." He paused. "Earl's name and background will be part of it, with his consent." They both looked at Earl. He was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the middle distance again, doing whatever calculations he did in the space behind those calm eyes. "My name has been out of circulation for 3 years," he said. "I put it there deliberately." "I know," Hale said. "There are people who will see it and want to know what I'm doing and why." "Yes." A long pause. The street sounds carried in the cold air, ordinary afternoon sounds. Someone's radio from a car at a light. "Do it," Earl said. "All of it." The press conference was not in the hospital parking lot. Hale arranged it at the Galton City Veterans Resource Center, a brick building 6 blocks from Route 9 that had a meeting room large enough for cameras and people and the specific kind of controlled chaos that preceded a 6 o'clock news cycle. Reyes handled the logistics with the efficiency of someone who had coordinated in worse conditions, which Sarah suspected covered a wide range. 23 people from Earl's community came into that room. They didn't stand in a block or perform anything. They sat in chairs along the walls and stood near the windows and occupied the space the way they occupied all spaces, like they had a reason to be exactly where they were. 3 of them were women, 2 of whom Sarah recognized from the parking lot, and all 3 of them had the same quality of restrained competence that she was beginning to understand as a kind of signature. The reporters arrived and set up their equipment and looked around the room with the professional curiosity of people assembling a story they hadn't fully mapped yet. Sarah watched them notice the people along the walls, and then noticed that the people along the walls were not nervous, and then try to understand what that meant. Hale and Earl stood at the front of the room. Sarah sat in the first row. She had changed into clothes that didn't have diner shift on them. Reyes had produced a clean shirt from somewhere without explanation, and her arm was in the sling, and her face had the kind of marks on it that were visible on camera and couldn't be described as anything other than what they were. She had been thinking on the drive over about what she was going to say and how. She had thought about framing, about clinical precision, about keeping her voice steady. She had decided to say exactly what happened, in the order it happened, without commentary, because the facts as they existed were sufficient, and anything she added would only give lawyers something to argue about. Hale spoke first. He was measured and specific. The incident, the footage, the filing of charges, the identification of Dane Fowler in the ATM footage, the federal inquiry into the Route 9 contract process. He used no language that was inflammatory and no language that minimized. He was, Sarah thought, extremely good at this. Then she spoke. She was still. She had learned years ago that stillness read as credibility in situations where emotion was expected. She described the parking lot in the order it had happened, the sound that had brought her outside, what she had seen, the decision she had made and why. She did not editorize. She said, "I covered him because he was on the ground, and the boot was coming down, and I was in a position to stop it." And she said it the same way she would have described an intervention in a trauma bay. This was the situation. This was the action indicated. This was the outcome. When she was done, one of the reporters asked, "Were you afraid?" She thought about it for a second. "Yes," she said, "but fear is information. It tells you the situation is serious. It doesn't tell you what to do about it." The room was quiet after that, in a way that felt different from the quiet before she'd spoken. The story ran at 10 and at 11 and on the regional outlet's website at 9:42. By midnight, it had been picked up by the state wire. By 6 the following morning, it was on 2 national aggregators, framed primarily around the federal inquiry into the Route 9 contract process, with the assault and Earl's background and Sarah's statement as the narrative through line. Sarah was asleep by 9:30 in the second bedroom of the shared house, lying very carefully on her right side with a pillow braced against her left. She had taken the prescribed pain medication for the first time, because her body had finally reached the point where stubbornness was no longer an adequate management strategy. She slept 7 hours, which was more than she'd expected, and woke to 43 text messages, 12 missed calls, and a voicemail from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be a producer from a national morning news program asking if she was available for a remote segment. She put the phone face down on the nightstand and lay still for a moment, breathing through the morning inventory of her injuries. Ribs, still bad, marginally better. Shoulder, stiff, functional. Face, tender, where the asphalt had taken the skin, but not painful in any way that mattered. She got up, made coffee, called Hale. "What happened overnight?" she said. "Quite a bit," Hale said. He sounded alert, which meant he'd either slept or he was very good at functioning without it. She suspected the latter. Bettina Suarez gave her statement to Polk's office at 9 p.m. She described the third offer meeting in detail, including Fowler's comment about property accidents. Polk's office is treating it as a threat in the context of the federal inquiry. A pause. Reyes identified this vehicle in the ATM footage, partial grill match to a current year Callaway Development Group fleet vehicle. Polk requested the traffic camera data from the Route 9 intersection an hour ago. Sarah sat down at the kitchen table. So Fowler's vehicle is traceable to Callaway. The fleet vehicle is registered to the company, Hale said. Fowler driving it is something they'll need to establish through the camera data, but given the ATM image, it's not a difficult inference. What's the Callaway side doing? Gerald Callaway released a second statement at 11 last night, after the 10 o'clock coverage. He's characterizing the federal inquiry as politically motivated and describing the press conference as an orchestrated campaign against his family. Hale's voice was dry, but not quite dismissive. His lawyer amended the chain of custody motion this morning to include a request that the ATM footage be subjected to authentication review before consideration. They're trying to slow everything down, she said. Yes, but they're also making noise that sounds like a family that's frightened, not a family that's confident. A brief pause. There's one more thing. Bryce Callaway's 2 companions from the parking lot, the 2 men who were with him, one of them contacted Detective Abramson's office this morning through his own lawyer, separately from the Callaway family's legal team. She held the coffee cup and waited. He wants to cooperate, Hale said. In exchange for consideration on the assault charges, he's offering a statement about the events leading up to the night of the 17th. Specifically, a conversation he says he was present for between Bryce and Dane Fowler, 3 days before the incident. Sarah set the cup down. 3 days before, she said. He's claiming the parking lot was not random, Hale said. He's saying Fowler identified Earl, the diner, the Thursday night schedule, and described what the goal of the encounter was supposed to be. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street, its sound ordinary and remote. What was the goal supposed to be, she said. According to the cooperating witness, Hale said carefully, Fowler described it as a conversation, an informal one. He said someone needed to make clear to Earl Maddox that his continued involvement in advising the Suarez property situation would have costs. He paused. He used the phrase, make him understand the math. She thought about Earl going down on the wet asphalt and Bryce Calloway's foot coming up, and the way make him understand the math had translated into practice. That's conspiracy to commit assault, she said. At minimum, Hale said. Combined with Bettina's statement about the property accident comment, Polk is looking at an obstruction and intimidation framework that connects Fowler to the assault to Gerald Calloway's contract strategy, and Gerald Calloway's contract strategy to the misuse of city procurement processes. He said it evenly, but she could hear what was underneath it. Gerald Calloway's lawyer spent 3 decades building the kind of institutional protection that insulated his client from exactly this kind of exposure. And now, she said, and now there are 2 witnesses, one of whom is cooperating and one of whom is Bettina Suarez, who is no longer scared, federal attention, a national news cycle, and a city committee that votes in 6 weeks. He let that sit for a moment. Gerald Calloway had a very bad night. She went to see Earl at 10. He was at Bettina's building, which was a 3-story structure on the corner of the Route 9 commercial block. Worn brick, well-maintained in the way of things that were old and cared for by someone who understood that maintenance was love expressed practically. The diner occupied the ground floor unit facing the street. 2 residential units above were occupied. The adjacent lots were fenced, weedy, but solid. Bettina Suarez answered the door to the building's interior stairwell before Sarah could knock. She was a small woman, mid-60s, with the kind of face that had been through considerable weather and was better for it rather than worse. She looked at Sarah for a long moment, taking in the sling, the marks on her face. "You're the nurse," Bettina said. "Yes," Sarah said. Bettina stepped back to let her in. "Earl said you were stubborn." "He's one to talk," Sarah said. Bettina almost smiled. "Come up." Earl was in Bettina's kitchen at the table with coffee and the kind of expression that meant he'd been up early and had been sitting with things. He looked better than he had in the hospital lot, which still wasn't good, but functional. The bruising on his face had deepened overnight the way bruising did, but the lines around his eyes were less tight. He'd slept, she thought. A few hours at least. The kitchen was warm and smelled like coffee and something baked, and there were photographs on the wall that she didn't look at directly because they were private and she was a guest. She sat across from Earl and Bettina put coffee in front of her without asking. "Hale briefed me," Earl said. "Good," she said. "Then we don't have to go through it." He looked at her. "How are the ribs?" "Manageable." A pause. "Yours?" "Same." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. It was a gesture she recognized from the counter at Dusty Mile. Something he did when he was thinking rather than when he was uncomfortable. "This is going to go to trial," he said, "even with the cooperating witness. These things don't resolve without going through a process." "I know," she said. "You'll be deposed, probably more than once. The Calloway legal team is going to try to complicate your account, your credibility, your background." "I know that too." He looked at her steadily. "You understand that the job at Garrison Valley and your statement and the press conference, they're going to try to make it look connected, like you had reasons beyond what you've said." "I had one reason," she said. "I watched someone get knocked down and I stepped in. The reasons that came after that came after." "Juries need to believe that." "Then juries need to watch the footage," she said. "Because everything I just described is on 4 cameras from 4 angles." Earl was quiet for a moment. Bettina had sat down at the end of the table with her own coffee and was watching the 2 of them with the particular expression of someone who had spent decades observing Earl Maddox and had learned what to look for. "You know what I keep coming back to," Earl said. Sarah waited. "When I went down in that parking lot," he said, "the first thought I had, after the pain, after the situational assessment, was that this was going to be a problem I'd have to manage quietly, that nobody was going to be able to help without it becoming complicated. He looked at his hands. I have spent a lot of years managing things quietly. Some of them deserved quiet. Some of them I made quiet because it was easier than the alternative. He paused. And then you came through that door and you were just there. Not because you knew anything, because it was the right thing. She didn't know what to do with that exactly, so she said nothing, which seemed like the right call. I'm not good at this, he said, saying these things. I noticed, she said. Something crossed his face that was close to an actual smile. The job at Garrison Valley. You're going to be good at it. I know, she said. I was good at my last one too. Bettina's phone rang. She looked at the screen and said, It's my lawyer, and stood and walked into the next room, and Sarah and Earl sat in the warm kitchen in the quiet that followed. She thought about the past 30 hours. The parking lot, the hospital, the cold morning, Hale's coffee, Polk's folder, the ATM image, the room of 23 people who had come because Earl had made one phone call. She thought about the press conference and the stillness she'd found in herself and the reporter's question. Were you afraid? Yes. But fear was information. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from Hale. Traffic camera data came back early. Plate is confirmed. Fowler's vehicle. Polk is moving on an arrest warrant. She read it twice and looked up at Earl. Fowler, she said. Polk has the plate. Warrant's coming. Earl absorbed this. His face didn't change dramatically. He didn't have the kind of face that changed dramatically. But something settled in it. The particular way a man looked when the thing he'd been waiting for arrived. Good, he said. One word, flat and final. Bettina came back into the kitchen. Her face was different from when she'd left. Not transformed, but shifted, like something she'd been holding in her posture had been set down. My lawyer says the committee's office called this morning, she said, requesting documentation of the Callaway Development Group's contact history regarding the property. She looked at Earl. They've apparently received several inquiries from committee members who saw the news coverage. Earl looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at her coffee. 6 weeks, she said. Less, maybe, Bettina said quietly. The building settled around them in its old brick way, and outside the kitchen window, Route 9 ran past with its ordinary late-morning traffic, and somewhere in the city, Polk's office was processing a warrant, and Gerald Calloway's lawyer was reading the traffic camera data with the particular expression of a man who had just run out of procedural options, and the city committee's office had made a phone call that it would not have made 36 hours ago. Then Hale called. She answered. Sarah. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. We have a problem. She was still. What kind of problem? Gerald Calloway held a press conference 20 minutes ago, Hale said. We didn't know it was coming. His team didn't send notice. A pause. He produced documentation, a signed contract dated 3 weeks ago between the Callaway Development Group and a medical staffing agency. The contract is for the placement of a trauma nursing specialist at Garrison Valley Hospital, funded through a Callaway Development Group community investment initiative. The kitchen was very quiet. He's claiming, Hale continued, his voice careful and precise, that Garrison Valley's offer to you was not independent. He's claiming it was arranged and funded by a party with direct financial interest in the Route 9 contract decision, and that your testimony and public statements are therefore financially motivated. He stopped. His lawyer is arguing that you are not a credible witness, that you were placed, Sarah, that everything you've said publicly, everything you said at that press conference, is part of a coordinated effort that compensated you. Sarah looked at Earl. Earl was looking at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment that stretched out in the warm kitchen with the coffee going cold and the building quiet around them. Is any of it true? She said. She didn't look away from Earl when she asked it. He held her gaze. No, he said. I asked Hale to make inquiries about your employment situation. I did not arrange a placement. I did not contact Garrison Valley. I did not fund anything. His voice was even. Belkin's offer was her own. She believed him. She believed him because she had been watching his face for 30 hours, and she understood now how it moved and what it meant when it moved. But belief was not the same as proof, and what Calloway had just done was not about truth. It was about the committee, about the 6 weeks, about making Sarah Voss into a question mark before the warrant landed and Fowler was taken in and the whole edifice had no more room to run. "Hale," she said, "I need Nora Belkin's direct line. Right now. And I need to know exactly when she first heard my name, from whom, and whether there is any documentation of that chain that has nothing to do with Earl or his network." "I'm already on it," Hale said. "But Sarah—" "What?" "Calloway's lawyer submitted the staffing contract to the news outlets with the press release. It's already running." A pause. "It looks real. The formatting, the agency letterhead, the signatures. It looks real." She stood up from the table. Her ribs tightened with the movement, and she pressed her arm against her side and breathed through it and thought with complete clarity about a document that looked real and was designed to make everything she'd done look purchased, and the timing of it. Not before the press conference, not before her statement, but after, when her credibility was already public and worth attacking. Whoever had made that document had been waiting for the right moment, and they had chosen it carefully. "Pull the contract," she said. "Every detail. Agency name, signatory, date, notary if there is one. Because if that contract is fabricated, there will be a thread somewhere." She looked at Earl. "And I want to find it before they think we're looking." The staffing agency was called Meridian Health Placement Services, and it had a website, a phone number, a registered business address in Denver, and a LinkedIn page with 47 followers, and every single one of those things had been created in the past 11 days. Reyes found it in 40 minutes. She called Hale while Sarah was still standing in Bettina's kitchen, and Hale put her on speaker, and Reyes's voice came through with the particular flat precision of someone delivering information they had known would matter. Meridian Health Placement Services was registered as an LLC with the Colorado Secretary of State's office on November 6th. That's 11 days ago. The registered agent is a man named Tobin Marsh, who is also the registered agent for 14 other LLCs filed in the past 2 years. 6 of which have documented connections to Callaway Development Group subsidiaries. A pause. The agency website domain was purchased on November 8th. The LinkedIn page was created November 9th. There is no record of Meridian Health Placement Services having placed a single employee anywhere. Bettina was standing in the kitchen doorway. Earl had not moved from his chair. Sarah was looking at the table and listening, and what she felt was not satisfaction, not yet, but the specific sensation of something structural failing, the way a building made the right sound before it went down. "Send everything to Polk," Sarah said. "Already sent," Reyes said. 15 minutes ago." She hung up. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Route 9 carried its midday traffic past Bettina's building, ordinary and indifferent. 11 days, Earl said. "They built it right after the third offer to Bettina," Sarah said. "After she said no again. They were already planning a contingency for if something went wrong." She looked at him. "They built a fake agency to discredit a witness they hadn't targeted yet, because they knew they were going to do something that would need a witness discredited." Earl was quiet for a long moment. "Gerald Calloway has been doing business in this city for 30 years, he said finally. He has never, in 30 years, had to face consequences for any of it. He said it without anger, which made it land harder than anger would have. He genuinely believes that's because he's careful. He doesn't understand that it's because nobody has ever pushed back hard enough and had the tools to make it stick." Sarah looked at him. "He understands it now, Mab. Polk arrested Dane Fowler at 2:17 that afternoon. Fowler was taken from the Callaway Development Group offices on the 7th floor of a downtown building, which meant he walked through the lobby in handcuffs past the reception desk and the security guard and the 2 people waiting for afternoon appointments. And the arrest was not a secret and was not designed to be. The charges filed at booking were conspiracy to commit assault, criminal intimidation in connection with a federal contract process, and fraud. The last one connected to Meridian Health Placement Services, whose creation Reyes's documentation had tied to a Callaway subsidiary account within 2 hours of her initial finding. Hale texted Sarah the news without commentary. She was at Garrison Valley Hospital by then, sitting across from Nora Belkin in her third-floor office, and she showed Belkin the text, and Belkin read it and set the phone back on the desk between them. "I need to ask you something directly," Sarah said. "Go ahead," Belkin said. "Did anyone connected to Earl Maddox, Captain Hale, or anyone in their network contact you about me before you called me this morning?" Belkin looked at her steadily. No. I received 3 calls from advisory committee members. 2 of them told me Earl Maddox was involved in last night's incident and gave me the broad outlines of who he was. None of them mentioned you by name. I pulled your credentialing record independently because I knew there was a nurse connected to the incident and I wanted to understand who I was dealing with. She paused. Your record is what made me call you, nothing else. Can you document that? The sequence, the calls, when you pulled the record, the timestamp on your decision? My assistant logs all calls, Belkin said. My system access records will show when I pulled your file and from which terminal. She looked at Sarah with the steady eyes of a woman who had spent decades in institutional management and understood exactly what was being asked and why. I can produce documentation that shows a clear and independent chain from the incident to my decision, with timestamps. I need that documentation, Sarah said. Today, if possible. Polk's office will want it. I'll have it ready in an hour, Belkin said. She reached across the desk and picked up the phone and called her assistant and gave the instruction with the same even competence with which she apparently did everything. Then she set the phone down and looked at Sarah. For what it's worth, she said, I had an opening that needed to be filled, and I found the right person. The circumstances that brought you to my attention were unusual. The decision itself was not. Sarah nodded. She looked at her hands. Her good hand was flat on her knee, and her other arm was still in the sling, and she was tired in the bone-deep way that had gone beyond coffee as a solution. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Belkin said with the dry precision of someone who had run hospitals long enough to know that paperwork preceded gratitude. You still have to do the job. Gerald Calloway's press conference response ran at 4 o'clock and was a significantly different document from the one at 2 p.m. The morning statement had been confident. The afternoon statement was the product of a legal team that had spent the previous 2 hours looking at Meridian Health Placement Services registration date, Fowler's arrest, the cooperating witness's forthcoming statement, and Nora Belkin's call logs, and had concluded that the position was no longer defensible in its current form. Gerald Calloway did not appear himself. His lawyer spoke. The statement acknowledged that Dane Fowler had acted in ways that went beyond his authorized role within the company. It expressed Gerald Calloway's personal shock and dismay at learning the full scope of Fowler's activities. It offered cooperation with the federal inquiry. It withdrew the characterization of Sarah Voss's testimony as financially motivated. It was in the technical language of people who spent careers managing institutional collapse, a controlled retreat. It was not an admission. It was not an apology. But it was a man using his lawyer as a human shield while the ground shifted under 30 years of carefully built immunity, and everyone who watched it understood that. Sarah watched it on her phone in the Garrison Valley Hospital parking lot, sitting in Reyes's car with the engine running for heat, and when it ended, she set the phone in her lap and looked out the windshield at the hospital's brick facade. That's not enough, she said. No, Reyes agreed. It's not. It's the beginning of not enough. She had the particular patience of someone who understood timelines. Federal cases move at their own speed. What happened today in the warrant, the arrest, the Meridian documentation, that's the foundation. The structure takes longer. The committee vote is in 6 weeks. The committee has now received a formal notification from Polk's office that the Route 9 contract process is under federal review, Reyes said. They can proceed with the vote or delay it pending the inquiry's outcome. Either way, the Calloway Development Group's bid is attached to a federal fraud investigation, which tends to be the kind of information that affects committee decisions. Sarah thought about Bettina Suarez declining 3 offers, about the hardware store that had been inspected into closure, about the quiet, grinding, years-long pressure of a family that had mistaken its ability to avoid consequences for a permanent condition. What happens to Bryce? She said. The assault charges stand, Reyes said. His companion's cooperation strengthens the case significantly. Combined with the footage and the conspiracy framework, the prosecution has a solid evidentiary position. She paused. He won't get community service. Sarah nodded. She looked at the hospital. Somewhere on the 3rd floor, Nora Belkin's assistant was compiling timestamps. I want to go see Earl, she said. I was back at the Veterans Resource Center, in the same meeting room where the press conference had been the evening before. The chairs had been rearranged. A few people she recognized from the parking lot were still there, doing the various quiet things that needed doing after something large had moved through. Calls, documentation, the organizational follow-through that never appeared in the dramatic version of events, but was the actual substance of them. Earl was at a table near the window with a cup of coffee and a legal pad that had handwriting on it in small, compressed script. He looked up when she came in. "Fowler's been processed," she said. "I know." He set the pen down. "Sit." She sat. The room had the slightly stale warmth of a space that had been occupied for a long time. And outside the window, the afternoon was going gray, and it felt for the first time in 36 hours like the acute phase was over and something else had begun. "How's the shoulder?" he said. "I have a follow-up appointment tomorrow," she said. "They think 2 weeks with the sling, then physical therapy." "The ribs?" 6 weeks, she said. "More or less." He nodded. He looked at the legal pad, then at his coffee, and then at her. "I've been thinking about what I said in Bettina's kitchen," he said, "about managing things quietly." "You don't have to—" "I want to finish it," he said. "Not sharp, just clear." She waited. "I spent 26 years in situations where quiet was a survival strategy," he said. "You learn to absorb things, not report them, not escalate them, not make them someone else's problem. Deal with it and move on, because that was the most functional response in the environments I worked in." He turned the coffee cup. "And then I came back, and I found out that quiet was also how the Calloway families of the world stayed comfortable. They counted on people like Bettina being too scared to report what Fowler said to her. They counted on people at that diner looking through the window and staying inside." He looked at her directly. "They were not counting on you." She thought about 8 months of getting smaller, about the parking lot and the specific, simple, unreasoned decision to cross 15 feet of wet asphalt. "I wasn't being strategic," she said. "I just couldn't stand there." "I know," Earl said. "That's exactly why it worked." She looked at the window. The light was going. In a few hours it would be dark, which meant it had been roughly 40 hours since she'd come through the diner's side door. And in 40 hours, the shape of her life had rearranged itself so completely that the version of it she'd been living yesterday felt like something she'd read about rather than inhabited. "My mother was a nurse," she said. She wasn't sure why she said it. Earl didn't respond, just waited, which was the right thing. She worked 30 years in emergency medicine, and she was genuinely remarkable at it. Not in a way that got her recognized, just in a way that meant the people who needed her got what they needed. She paused. "She told me once that the most important thing about her job wasn't the clinical training. She said the most important thing was that she had decided, early on, that the person in front of her was her whole job. Not the policy, not the liability, not the administrator watching from the door, just the person." Earl was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like someone worth becoming," he said. Sarah looked at him. "Yeah," she said. "She was." 3 days later, Sarah Voss sat in Nora Belkin's office and signed her employment contract. The paperwork was thorough. Credentialing verification, background check confirmation, unit assignment, start date, compensation, the specific terms of the team lead position that had been open for 11 months. Her ribs still hurt when she breathed too deeply. Her shoulder was in its second week of the sling. She signed everything carefully with her right hand, and Belkin witnessed it, and when it was done, they shook hands across the desk. 6 weeks, Belkin said. "That's when I need you functional enough to take the floor." "I'll be ready," Sarah said. Belkin looked at her with the steady, measuring assessment she'd had in every meeting. "I imagine you will." The Meridian Health Placement Services documentation went to the district attorney's office and Polk's federal inquiry team simultaneously, and the fraud charge against Fowler was upgraded to include conspiracy to obstruct a federal contracting process. Gerald Calloway's lawyer spent a week in escalating negotiations before Gerald Calloway himself appeared at the DA's office, without a press statement, and began what would eventually become a cooperation agreement that took 3 months to finalize and required, among other things, the complete withdrawal of Calloway Development Group's Route 9 bid. Bryce Calloway entered a plea on 2 counts of assault causing bodily harm and 1 count of conspiracy to intimidate. He received 18 months. The comfortable certainty that had been in his voice in the parking lot was entirely absent in the courtroom, replaced by the particular expression of a young man who had finally encountered a situation his father's money couldn't reshape. His two companions received different outcomes calibrated to their cooperation. The one who had talked first received a deferred sentence and probation. The other, who had held out longer, received 6 months and a fine. Dane Fowler went to trial. It took 4 days. The jury deliberated for less than a day. He received 4 years. Gerald Calloway did not go to prison. This was one of the unsatisfying facts of the situation, and Sarah did not pretend otherwise when people asked her about it. He lost the contract. He lost Fowler, who had apparently been the operational intelligence behind 30 years of carefully managed pressure. He lost his seat on the Planning Commission, which he resigned before it could be taken from him. He lost the architectural immunity that wealth and connection had provided, which was invisible until it was gone, and then was very visibly gone. Whether that constituted justice in its fullest sense was a question she sat with honestly and didn't resolve cleanly, because clean resolutions were for people who hadn't watched a hardware store close. Bettina Suarez did not sell her property. The competing bid on the Route 9 contract was awarded in an emergency session 6 weeks and 2 days after the night in the parking lot. The development plan preserved the existing commercial structures along the corridor and prioritized repair over replacement. Bettina's building remained. Dusty Mile Diner remained. Walt Okafor, to his credit, put a decent slice of peach pie on the counter for Earl the first Thursday after all of it, without being asked, and didn't say anything about what he had or hadn't done the night the whole thing started. Earl ate the pie. He didn't bring it up either. Some things didn't need to be spoken to be understood. Sarah's first shift at Garrison Valley Hospital's emergency trauma unit was on a Tuesday, 5 weeks and 3 days after she signed the contract. Her ribs were at 80%. Her shoulder was out of the sling and in physical therapy twice a week, which was uncomfortable and necessary, and she did it without complaining because complaining didn't accelerate tissue repair. She walked into the unit at 6:55 a.m. for a 7 o'clock start, which was not early by her previous standards, but felt right as a statement of intent. The unit was a 12-bay trauma floor with an attached surgical interface corridor, properly staffed, recently renovated, and led, until 11 months ago, by a woman who had been good at her job and had left under circumstances the hospital was apparently still managing the institutional hangover from. The team was 6 nurses on the day shift, 2 technicians, and a rotating attending position. They knew she was coming. They had the wary, assessing quality of a unit that had been understaffed at the leadership level for nearly a year and had opinions about it. She did not give a speech. She introduced herself, confirmed she'd reviewed the unit protocols, and had questions she'd be asking throughout the shift, rather than all at once, and then she went to work. The first 3 hours were straightforward by trauma standards. A construction site laceration requiring deep sutures, 2 separate vehicle accident assessments, one of which escalated to surgical and which she managed the handoff on with the attending, and a medication reaction that required a fast intervention she handled while walking the technician through the documentation simultaneously. She made 2 decisions that cut against protocol in minor ways and explained her reasoning for both while she made them, and was right both times, which she had expected but had also known was not guaranteed, because the thing about trusting your training was that you had to do it. Knowing training was not the same as certainty. At 10 o'clock, during a 20-minute lull, one of the nurses, a woman named Petra, 10 years in trauma, the unofficial institutional memory of the unit, and clearly the person whose opinion the others calibrated by, came to stand next to her at the station. "The medication reaction," Petra said, "the way you caught the symptom progression." "I've seen that presentation before," Sarah said. "It's easy to misread as a secondary effect of the primary complaint. Dr. Ewell would have ordered a different intervention." "I know," Sarah said. "I disagree with Dr. Ewell's approach on that presentation. I'll discuss it with him directly." Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay," and went back to her station, and Sarah understood that this was the beginning of something that would take months to build properly and would not always be comfortable and would be worth it. Earl came to the diner the following Thursday. She was not working there anymore, but she drove by on her way home from an evening errand and saw his motorcycle in the lot, and she pulled in. He was at the counter. She sat down next to him, and Walt appeared with coffee without being asked, which was a language Walt spoke fluently. "How's the job?" Earl said. "Real," she said. "Hard. Good." She wrapped her hands around the mug. The team is figuring out what to do with me. I'm figuring out what to do with them. It'll take time. Things that are worth building take time, he said. She looked at him sideways. Was that actual wisdom, or are you just tired? Both, he said. She almost laughed. Didn't, because her ribs were still at 80% and laughing was inadvisable, but almost. They drank coffee in the particular comfortable silence she had found at this counter months ago, when she had been a different version of herself. Smaller, quieter, systematically reduced by a run of things that had gone wrong and had felt permanent. She thought about that version with something that wasn't quite pity, because pity was the wrong frame for a person who had been doing what they needed to do to survive a hard stretch. But she thought about her with the recognition of distance, the specific understanding you got when you could look back at a place you had been and see it clearly because you were no longer inside it. She had been invisible, and she had thought invisibility was a condition rather than a choice, and she had been wrong about that. Invisibility was something that happened to you when enough things went wrong in the right sequence, and it felt permanent because it was comprehensive, and it felt like who you were because you were inside it and couldn't see the edge. But it wasn't who she was. It never had been. What she was had been there the whole time, waiting in the muscle memory and the training and the decision to cross 15 feet of wet asphalt towards something that needed her. It had just needed the right moment to be visible again. The parking lot had been the wrong moment, in every practical sense. Bad odds, no backup, cracked ribs as a consequence. She would make the same decision again without hesitation, and not because she was reckless or because she hadn't understood the risk, but because some things were simply the right thing to do, and you either did them or you didn't. And the version of herself who didn't do them was a version she didn't recognize and didn't want to. She thought about what Earl had said in Bettina's kitchen. People who run toward the problem instead of away from it are my kind of people. She thought about her mother, working 30 years of emergency medicine with the patient in front of her as the whole job. She thought about Petra at the station that morning, saying okay and meaning something larger than the word. I need to go, she said. Early shift tomorrow. Earl nodded. How early? 6:45. He turned back to his coffee. Go sleep. She put money on the counter and stood up and pulled her jacket on. Both arms now, the shoulder complaining in a specific way that meant it was healing rather than damaged, which she had learned to distinguish over the past weeks. She looked at Earl's profile, the gray beard and the calm eyes and the coffee cup he turned in his hands when he was thinking. Earl, she said. He looked at her. Thank you, she said. For calling Hale, for making it move. He shook his head slightly. You made it move, he said. I just made a phone call to people who were already going to show up. She stood there for a moment, her jacket straight, her shoulder holding, her ribs at 80% and improving. And she thought about the parking lot and the cold rain and the sound of an engine that had been rebuilt by hand, and the way the whole shape of a night could turn on the decision of one person to cross 15 feet of asphalt and mean it. Good night, Earl, she said. Night, Sarah, he said. She walked out through the diner's front door this time, not the side exit, and the cold November air was the same cold it had always been, and the parking lot was lit and quiet and ordinary, and her car was where she'd left it, and she drove home through a city that had changed in the ways that mattered and stayed the same in the ways that didn't. And she went to sleep, and in the morning she got up and went back to work. That was the whole of it. Not a clean ending. Not the kind where every wound healed on schedule and every institution reformed overnight, and every person who had looked through the diner window instead of coming out found the courage they'd been missing. Clean endings were the kind people told each other to make the hard parts feel temporary. The hard parts were not temporary. They were structural, and they required structural responses. And structural responses were built by people who showed up every day to the slow and unglamorous work of not looking away. Sarah Voss was that kind of person. She had always been that kind of person. She had just spent 8 months in a world that hadn't needed her to be, and had needed her anyway, in a parking lot on a rainy Thursday night, in a way that turned out to matter more than any of them had understood in the moment. The thing about being the person who runs toward the problem is that you don't always know, when you're running, what you're running into. You just know you can't be the one who stays. She couldn't be the one who stayed.